What Really Happened with your host, Mike Rivero. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Thursday, October 11th, 2018. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, ready to answer the phone, put you on the air with your comments, questions, and opinions. Obviously, the top story remains today, Tropical Storm Michael. And this was a bad one. No getting away from that. So far, there are 2 confirmed deaths from the storm, but that is probably going to go up. There are 700,000 people without power in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And it's estimated that the damage so far will top $20 billion. Now, the storm is over the Carolinas now, which they didn't need because they already had another one earlier this year, and is proceeding northward, and the center of the storm track is still going to pass directly over Norfolk, Virginia. But it is weakening. It's down to a tropical storm. It's no longer a hurricane, so that's good news. Now, over at Mexico Beach, Florida, which is where the storm came ashore, it's gone. I saw a drone video flying over what's left of Mexico Beach, and you can see some foundations, and that's about it. The storm just erased that town from the map, and I'm sure they'll rebuild and everything, but it is a potent reminder that Mother Nature is still in charge. For all of our vaunted technology and all of our whiz-bang science, and not to mention our weaponry, Mother Nature still holds the ace card, if you will, on current events here. I saw another interesting little video where this Weather Channel reporter was reporting on the hurricane, and this 2x4 just flies by him at a high rate of speed. If it had hit him, it probably would have seriously injured him, if not killed him. And then the Weather Channel reporter turns around to this NBC reporter who's literally getting blown away, and helps get him over to some place where he can shelter. So this was a bad one here. Another story that's in the news right now, apparently they've had a little bit of a whoopsie over at Roscosmos. They were trying to launch 2 astronauts. Well, one was a cosmonaut, one was an astronaut to the International Space Station, and the rocket suffered a serious malfunction. Pieces started coming off of it. The video that was being sent back from inside the spacecraft showed the occupants just being, rocked side to side, and a lot of people are saying, it looked like Challenger all over again, but the crew got back to Earth safely. The Russian cosmonaut joked that was a very quick flight, and but they came back down in Kazakhstan, and they were recovered. They're back in Moscow, and Russia is investigating this as a criminal case, and that may be because of that incident that happened a short while ago on the ISS, where a hole was found to have been drilled in the pressure vessel of one of the Soyuz spacecraft. So I think the Russians are thinking somewhere in their space program they have a saboteur. Turning to our domestic politics here, have you noticed the Democrats are becoming increasingly combative? They're fearing losing their grip on power, or they want more power. Everybody who's got power always wants more power. Same thing with money. Doesn't matter how much money you've got, you want more money. That's why we call them money junkies. And so we also have power junkies. And the Democrats are definitely into that. But they're beginning to recognize that it's created a public image problem for them. And so now the new directive has gone out to the corporate media not to use the phrase mob when they're describing these violent protests like we saw up in Portland. They're just to be called protesters. They're just protesters. We're going to even the thing, because they've got an image problem right now, less than 4 weeks to the midterm elections. And Don Lemon was on CNN tonight, basically talking to people about this, and he just got frustrated with Matt Lewis of the Daily Beast, who was saying there was a double standard in the media at work there, downplaying these violent mobs and calling them simply protesters. Even Tucker Carlson got in on the situation, saying it's one left-wing riot after another, but the leftist leaders have decided the problem is you. And in a piece posted this week, the Post explained that in order to win the midterm elections, those Republicans have cast the Trump resistance movement as an angry mob. And obviously you can hear the spin in that word cast. It implies it's a misrepresentation. Oh, just because these people in Portland beat up an old lady in a wheelchair and, broke some windows, and there's no reason to consider them a violent mob here. And, I mean, we have seen, Steve Scalise was shot. Rand Paul was attacked, several ribs broken. Yes, the left is getting very, very violent. Martin Armstrong basically said, we've crossed the line here. He was responding to Hillary Clinton out there saying that Democrats are not going to be civil unless they're allowed to win. There's an implied threat there that if, in fact, the Democrats lose the midterm elections, that there'll be more violence in the streets. All right, we're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are rejoining the network here. Now, former Obama Attorney General Eric Holder was at a campaign event and was caught on video, basically implying violence, saying that, when Republicans go low, we kick them. He said it is time for us as Democrats to be as tough as they are, to be as dedicated as they are, to be as committed as they are. But you don't see a lot of Republicans out there committing these acts of violence. It really is very much one-sided here. Rand Paul is taking exception to some of Cory Booker's recent comments, saying, if you keep pushing like this, somebody's going to get killed. There's going to be an assassination. And Rand Paul is absolutely right about that. And we have this story here where basically this guy had a truck and it had some Trump bumper stickers on it. And he left it. When he came on back, it had been burned. Just totally torched. So that's how tense it is getting out there. So the optics really are bad. And according to Rasmussen reports, they're finding Republicans are very angry about what happened during the hearings into Brett Kavanaugh. And it's energized them. And Rasmussen is saying Republicans are now much more likely to vote than Democrats in the coming midterm elections. And maybe that's why the Democrats are out there in a panic. Because if Republicans, come on out in force to vote, then even the illegal immigrants aren't going to be able to save them. So there may not be this blue wave. And there are a lot of Democrats who got just disgusted with what they saw. And a lot of them are just going to stay home. They support the Democratic Party, but after what they've seen, it's very hard to get motivated to go on out there and vote for a Democratic candidate. Because it makes you feel like you're tainted, like you're stained. Now, speaking of the Democrats, Michael Bloomberg, who was previously registered as an independent, has now re-registered as a member of the Democratic Party, and he is weighing a run for the 2020 presidential campaign. Now, he doesn't know what he's up against because according to Infowars.com, Hillary is going to run again in 2020. And the DNC has already decided she will be the candidate, and they don't really care what you Democrat voters think about it. It's going to be 2016 all over again. They're going to rig the primaries for Hillary and try and shove her into that Oval Office. So it's going to be another ugly election. And Donald Trump, assuming that the GOP retains control of Congress, Trump had better do something about election fraud in this country, or he's gone. He's a one-term president. He's not going to stand a chance in 2020 because the vote riggers that tried to steal the election for Hillary in 2016 are going to be trying twice as hard in 2020. Now, turning over to Rod Rosenstein, there are multiple reports that he has given a verbal resignation to Chief of Staff John Kelly following this New York Times report that he wanted to wear a wire to try and gather evidence to find some way to get Donald Trump out of the Oval Office. And last week, Freedom Caucus Chairman Mark Meadows, who had filed articles of impeachment against Rosenstein, called for the Deputy Attorney General to appear before Congress under oath this week. Rosenstein has now notified Congress he will not show up. He was supposed to show up today, nor will he turn over the subpoenaed memos. Got something to hide there, Rod? Anyway. Now, as you know, there's a lot of talk about suing online media like WikiLeaks for publishing leaks, publishing accurate leaks. Trump's lawyers have now tweeted on out saying that no, in point of fact, WikiLeaks and the independent media are just as immune from being sued for publishing accurate leaks as the big corporate media like Facebook. So we're going to have that on our side here. Remember this guy, Jackson Costco, lives in Washington, D.C., and he was the guy who came on out doxing the personal information about these GOP senators as part of a campaign to pressure them to vote against confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. And then he threatened to basically leak the Republican senators' children's health information if any of these people dared to go to the authorities about his activities. Well, apparently it turned out when he got arrested, he had cocaine and meth, and they're saying now that he was high on Capitol Hill. Probably blended right on in. So after failing to take down Justice Kavanaugh, the Democrats are now on the warpath against the Supreme Court itself. This is coming out of the Wall Street Journal. And they're basically, well, the Supreme Court, you know. And what's really amazing are all these liberal Democrats who've been making these public statements saying that really the Supreme Court should not be bound by the Constitution. You know, we're progressives and we just can't be tied to that Constitution here. Well, I'm sorry, we're all tied to that Constitution. And if that Constitution goes away, then there is no foundation for the authority of the federal government. That's the way it works. That Constitution is the original contract with America. It is the set of rules under which we, the people, allow the government to act as custodian for our national sovereignty, and you're not allowed to just walk away from it. You either play by the rules or you're not a legitimate government. So they're just, the Democrats are raging against the Supreme Court. Oh, they're too stuck on the Constitution. Really, that something has to be done about that. And over at Google, one of their executives literally came on out and said that maybe the Senate should be abolished. This was from Google Ventures partner Ken Norton. And Norton then tweeted what basically amounted to a bribery scheme to try and force Susan Collins to change her mind and vote no on Kavanaugh. So, I mean, that's how dirty the politics have become in this country. Now, politics has always been dirty. It's a dirty business. And we all know that. But we're now in a season, we're now in an era where it's becoming very obvious and visible to the public. In the past, politics was dirty, but it was always kept hidden to sort of reassure the American people that government was running smoothly, that everybody was getting along, that the system operated the way it was supposed to under the rules of the Constitution. Now we've seen, no, it isn't. It's bribery, it's blackmail, it's threats, it's coercion, it's manipulation. And I think a lot of Republicans need to realize that what's at stake this upcoming midterm election is looking at these crybaby Democrats who are so quick to discard the rules and play dirty. They want to take control of the Congress. And I think it would be an epic disaster if they succeed. Because I don't believe Hillary Clinton when she says all of a sudden they're magically going to become civil if they win the election. No, that's not going to happen. Their personalities are what their personalities are. They're going to go on being exactly the way they are right now. Spoiled children who want what they want when they want it and think it constitutes a natural law. And the corporate media is still out there trying to put this Russiagate. Russia interfered with the 2016 elections. And over at the New York Slimes, Scott Shane and Mark Mazzetti wrote an article of this highly effective Russian government exploitation of social media. It had an impact. Okay? But there was a lot of anti-Clinton, pro-Trump messages out there that didn't originate with Russia. I certainly put out my share of them as well. But looking at the data that these two authors cite to show the Russian campaigns on Facebook and Twitter were effective reveals a huge betrayal of journalistic responsibility. They've constructed a case that is fundamentally false and misleading with statistics that deliberately exaggerated the real effectiveness of social media efforts by orders of magnitude. Now, Stormy Daniels' lawyer, Michael Avenatti, desperate to keep his name in the media headlights, has now gone public claiming that Donald Trump Jr. will be indicted by the end of the year. So it's pandering to the audience here. We are already starting to see the backlash, if you will, from Christine Ford's false allegations against Brett Kavanaugh. And apparently over in Manhattan, their district attorney has dropped one of the accusations against movie mogul Harvey Weinstein, former movie mogul. And apparently evidence emerged that a police detective had coached a witness to stay silent about evidence that cast doubt on the account of one of his three accusers. And apparently this involved this lady who claimed that she met Harvey at a restaurant and that when she visited him in the office, he forced her to have oral sex on him. And the friend was saying that no, it happened quite differently. And in fact, it was consensual because the girl wanted to get an acting gig from Harvey. And yes, that sort of thing does happen on a regular basis in Hollywood. Plenty of willing women who will do that, thinking it will give them an edge over the competition. Now, the other day we were talking about how Melania Trump came out with a very mature, reasoned statement that women should be heard, but there has to be proof before you make accusations against men. And ABC came on out just scolding the First Lady and saying, you have to stand with women. So good for Melania. I'm really liking her. We're going to take a break here for commercials and we'll be right back. And aloha America, welcome back to our show here and turning over to the war zones, emphasis on the plural. An American C-130 transport plane has crashed in Afghanistan, killing at least 11 people. And among the dead are several U.S. troop members and contracted civilians whose nationalities have not been disclosed. The Taliban is claiming responsibility for shooting down the aircraft. And U.S. authorities are refusing to confirm and previously denied any hostile engagement. Trump apparently is getting ready to double down on Afghanistan, even though we are clearly failing there. Back in 2001, the Taliban was all but gone. And here we are 17 years later, and the Taliban is now in control of significant portions of Afghanistan. The imposed puppet government is corrupt to the core. The population of Afghanistan is basically turning away from the puppet rulers and toward the Taliban. And so Trump is just going to pour more people and weapons and money into there. They don't want to admit that they're losing in Afghanistan the way they're losing in Syria. And of course, they want to keep that oil pipeline and the flow of opium going. Now, the United Nations is reporting that 8,000 Afghan civilians have been killed so far this year, and reminds everybody that deliberately targeting and murdering civilians are serious violations of international humanitarian law that amount to war crimes. And they're calling for a peaceful settlement to the conflict. Well, I'm sure from the point of view of the Taliban, the solution, the peaceful solution, is for the U.S. to pack up its puppet rulers and go home. Now, down in Syria, ISIS has ambushed some U.S.-backed Kurds in eastern Syria, trying to advance against these. The Kurds were trying to advance against these ISIS-held towns in eastern Syria. They're finding it very, very difficult, and they're still fighting back and forth on that one. Apparently, and this is an important one to keep in your mind, ISIS has now seized toxic agents. ISIS terrorists have been able to seize toxic chemicals due to the irresponsible actions of the representatives of the Western countries. This is coming from Lieutenant General Vladimir Savchenko, chief of the Russian Center for the Reconciliation of the Conflicting Sides. According to Savchenko, on October 9th, a group of ISIS-linked militants attacked the headquarters of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in the village of al-Latamana, and they were basically acquired 2 very large cylinders containing chlorine, which have now been transported to southern Aleppo and handed over to members of another terrorist group, Haras al-Din. Now, we have been talking about, is the U.S. ready to admit defeat in Syria? No, of course not. How are they going to justify a new attack? Well, they need a false flag, another chemical weapons attack, and it looks like they're getting ready to do just that. Oh, Assad is gassing his own people again. Send in the cruise missiles. And again, to determine whether you're being lied to or not, look for what should be there and isn't. And what isn't there is a reason for Assad to use chemical weapons. He's all but won the war. He doesn't need to use chemical weapons. And he knows that that's exactly what the U.S. wants him to do, so they can justify renewed aggression. And by the way, have you ever noticed every time Assad is supposedly using chemical weapons, he never uses them on the enemy troops? He never used them on ISIS, never uses them on Al-Qaeda. It's always women and children. Oh, my goodness. It's for the shock value. They're trying to lead you with your emotions. Oh, it's women and children. Assad is gassing them. Really? Can somebody explain why he would do something that's stupid? Well, he's Assad. That's all it takes. No, it isn't. We need more than that. Now, Mike Pompeo has come on out with this grandiose statement saying that if Iran does not leave Syria, that the United States will cut all reconstruction aid to Syria. In other words, having gone on in and spent a bunch of taxpayer money to blow up the place, they're going to refuse to spend more taxpayer money to help Syria rebuild. This is a big strategic mistake on Pompeo's part, because that would create an opportunity for Russia to step in with reconstruction aid, bringing Syria fully into the Russian sphere of influence. And Pompeo is Secretary of State, and he doesn't think these things through. Anyway, So we're coming up here on another commercial break. When we come on back, we're going to be talking more about America's weapons. Are they really everything we have been told they are? And the answer may alarmingly be no. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And we're talking about America's military might and just how mighty it really is. So I'm looking at this article that came out of Zero Hedge, and it's basically talking about the S-300 versus the F-35, and how stealth and invincibility are not really synonyms. Now, the open issue is nobody really knows for sure how effective the F-35's stealth is going to be. We reported yesterday the Pentagon has ordered new testing ever since Syria acquired the S-300. We know that what the United States knows about the S-300 is based on a missile that they got their hands on from Greece decades ago. And obviously Russia has been improving it since then. So they don't really know what's in the current generation of S-300s. This article is also confirms again once more, stealth doesn't work against low frequency radar. That was a big secret, but now it's out. Stealth is usually designed to deal with a narrow range of radar frequencies. And there are other issues as well. Stealthy aircraft are limited in how much they can carry. They can't have weapons on the wing pylons. Those will show up on radar. They have these little weapons bays inside the fuselage. And when those weapons bays open, the airplane becomes visible to radar. And if the stealth plane turns on its own electronic systems like jammers or any emitting device, that can be detected by ground sensors and used to send a missile in. There are missiles that are designed to home in on radio emissions, usually against radar. But I wouldn't be too surprised if somebody somewhere has developed a missile that homes in on jammers. So, in any event, it may be a little while before we find out more about this, because the U.S. military has now grounded the entire fleet of F-35 fighter jets following that crash in South Carolina. Apparently, investigation of that crash has revealed a problem that may affect all of the F-35 fighters. And they're all grounded for inspections to see how widespread the problem may be. Meanwhile, over in Belgium, an F-16 that was undergoing maintenance caught on fire, was totally destroyed. A second plane suffered collateral damage. 2 people were injured. Now, this article came out of Defense News, and the headline reads, "The U.S. Army is preparing to fight in Europe, but can it even get there?" This is an important logistical question. And it's basically saying that, yeah, the U.S. Army is getting ready to meet the Red Menace over there in Europe. But if war were to break out tomorrow, the U.S. military would be hard-pressed to actually move the number of tanks and heavy guns and equipment needed to face off with the Russian forces. And then there's the other problem. How would they be supplied and sustained? Because the U.S. sea lift capability is orders of magnitude smaller than it was during World War II. Remember the Liberty ships? And when you count in the fact that the commercial shipbuilding industry in the U.S. is all but gone, the United States is not in a position to start the kind of massive buildup of logistic ships it undertook during wartime decades ago. So they don't really have the ships to support a war in Europe, nor does the United States have the factories with which to start building them. That's a bad situation. Another story coming out of Defense News, U.S. Sea Lift can't count on Navy escorts in the next big war. The current U.S. Navy is about half the size it was during the height of the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s, and most of its ships are going to be busy with combat operations. And it may be too busy to always be able to escort the convoys that we're taking across the Atlantic. Now, this is coming from Mark Busby, the retired Rear Admiral, who now leads the Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration. And he's saying the Navy has been candid enough with Military Sealift Command and me, they will not have enough ships to escort us. Basically, it's you're on your own, go fast, stay quiet. That is a really bad situation to be thinking about going to war against Russia and or China. See, right now, the buildup in Europe has been very, very slow, and Sealift Command can handle it. But if war breaks out, it's going to really ramp up, and what we're being told is the logistical backup to support that war isn't there. They don't have enough ships to rapidly move the forces onto the European continent, and even after they do that, they don't have the ships to keep them supplied. And now we're finding out from the Navy that those ships that are making that trip across the Atlantic may not have any protection. I hope somebody in the Pentagon is really thinking very clearly about this before we go any further with this poking the Russian bear, as it were. Now, U.S. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis has called on the Pentagon to bring at least 80% of its key fighter jets to combat readiness. And it may come as a surprise to most people, considering how many wars we're fighting all over the world. Few of our warplanes are kept combat ready. And the planes in question, the F-35, the F-22, the F-16, and F-18, are in a dismal state of air readiness. Last year, fewer than half of the F-22s were mission capable, and the notoriously expensive F-35, of course, saw its first crash last month, just days after the fleet took to the air for the first time. So we don't have the ships, we don't have the naval protection, we don't have the warplanes. Stealth may not work against low-frequency radar. This is not looking good. This is not looking good. Okay, over in Syria, British General Felix Gidney is screaming about how Russia is winning the information war. And he's out there saying Western countries must resist Moscow in the information space. And Gedney said the Russians are really good at this, better than us. Well, the Russians are cheating. They're telling the truth. That makes it easy to win the information war. Over in Yemen, in Hodeidah, a Saudi airstrike has killed 5 farmers. And yeah, they targeted another crowd of civilians near one of the charity drinking water pumps set up in the city. I'm going to take a wild guess here. They wanted to destroy the water supply. So the strike killed 5 civilians identified as farmers by the local hospital. This is the second incident of Saudi strikes in Hodeidah killing civilians this week. Monday, they killed a bunch of beekeepers. Now, Saudi forces have been attacking Hodeidah for months, and they're still not able to take it here. But the civilian death toll in Yemen has now increased by 164%. Weddings, funerals, the school bus full of children, people getting water at the fountain, beekeepers. And there's a lot of global condemnation for what's going on. And there's a lot of pressure on the U.S. government to do something. Now, the U.S. is trying to pretend they're getting tough with Saudi Arabia over this thing with the missing journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. And you've probably seen all over the news about how, he was killed and dismembered inside the Saudi consulate. Well, how does anybody know? The only thing that's actually known for a fact is that security video shows him walking into the consulate under his own power, but doesn't show him walking out. We had that one report, supposedly sourced to a member of the Saudi family, that he was basically smuggled out in a van, thrown on a plane, and flown to Saudi Arabia, where he is still alive. But nobody knows for a fact that he's dead, let alone dismembered. That's just there for the shock value. Oh my goodness, those evil Saudis. But it's a great deal of sneering at each other, and it's not really changing anything. Now, U.S. senators are slamming Mike Pompeo's approval of more military aid to Saudi Arabia, along with the United Arab Emirates, which is also part of this coalition attacking Yemen. But Donald Trump has come on out and said that blocking the Saudi arms sale would be hurting us. And that confirms just what interests actually drive American foreign policy. It's not sticking up for human rights or punishing rogue regimes. It's selling weapons. It's selling weapons. Trump is out there parroting that line that war is good for the economy. We have jobs. We're putting people to work making bombs and bullets. And the war business is looking really good. The U.S. sold more than $54 billion, with a B, in military equipment to foreign governments in the fiscal year that ended September 30th. And that's a 62% increase in foreign military sales. They're saying it may not be a record, but it's close. So yeah, got to sell the weapons, got to sell those weapons out there. Now, oddly enough, even though American arms manufacturers are selling to foreign countries, the Pentagon, trying to, I guess, get a good deal, is looking more and more at foreign countries and their weapons as they race to rearm. Because the U.S. has been at war for 17 years now. The stockpiles are drawn down. The older weapons are worn out. They're not really designed to last all that long. And so the Pentagon is going to other countries. So now war is good for the other nations' economies. And we ought not to be dependent on those other countries for our weapons and military supplies, because in the event the war spins out of control, those countries could just shut it off. Say, no, go buy your tanks someplace else here. Now, a little bit of a victory for the people of Yemen. Apparently, Yemen has developed a new domestically manufactured missile. They're not sharing any details. They won't even share what it's called. But they used it to basically blow up a military vessel belonging to Saudi Arabia off the northwestern coast of Hajjah yesterday, reportedly killing everybody aboard. And the Saudi vessel was carrying out attacks on the residential districts of Hairan and Medi in Hajjah when it was hit. So, Saudi Arabia is targeting civilians. Mike Pompeo's come out with another very bizarre statement here. He said that Israel is everything we want the entire Middle East to look like going forward, and that U.S.-Israel relations are stronger than ever. Obviously, that last one is accurate. But how are you going to make the whole Middle East look like Israel without giving every country in the Middle East 38 billion U.S. tax dollars? Because Israel looks the way Israel looks because of all the money pouring in from outside. The irony here is that Israel was established to be an independent nation for the safety and security of the Jewish people. But it's not independent. It is very dependent on money pouring in from the United States, from Europe, from its supporters all over the world. It's not independent at all. And the actions of the government of Israel are in fact making the world a much more dangerous place for the Jewish people. Up in Kiev, there's a report, this is coming out of Fort Russ. Kiev is now preparing a provocation against the Russian border guard in the Azov Sea. And apparently the aim is to discredit the Russian border guard. This is a source in Crimea. Now, we've been hearing that with Syria basically at a stalemate, that the U.S. is shifting to Ukraine as the sparking point for a conflict with Russia. And again, getting on back to that issue of logistics, the starving Ukrainian army is now looting and pillaging the Donbass locals. And the Ukrainian military is described as not only starving, but demoralized. And apparently they're basically just looting the grocery stores. You know, there's an old saying that amateurs discuss strategy and tactics, but professionals discuss logistics. Because if you don't have good logistics, the war is already over and you lost. Now, Russia is starting to stretch its maritime muscles. It's reshaping its doctrine. And what it comes down to, again, is awareness that if there is a war in Europe, those Atlantic sea lanes of communication are going to become very important. And Russia wants to be prepared to patrol them, to interdict the convoys, which is going to be easy if the Navy is not able to protect them. Now, over in Korea, South Korea wants to lift sanctions on North Korea. That would really put an end to all of this U.S. nonsense about, you know, North Korea must do this and North Korea could do that. And what's worse, South Korea could start severing their ties with the United States. They want the U.S. military out of there. So the Koreas are going to go back to the Korea being a Korea, unified Korea. Meanwhile, Trump has come on out and said, South Korea won't lift sanctions without U.S. approval. Sounds like famous last words to me here. Now, Mike Pompeo is complaining that North and South Korea are talking peace without him being present. But the Koreans may understandably think it's none of his business. So we're going to take another break for commercials, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, and let's talk about the economic news for a while. Another bad day on the stock markets, not as bad as yesterday, but very worrying to a lot of people. The Dow at one point was down below 600 points. It ended at about, I think it was 590-something. And it's making people skittish. They're wondering what's going on. And obviously, the rising interest rates coming out of the Federal Reserve are part of the problem. The backlash from the tariffs are another problem. Because of sanctions, a lot of markets and suppliers are cut off from our economy as well. So there are a lot of overlapping factors. But of course, the Democrats are already out there blaming Donald Trump. Oh, this is his economy. Look, what a terrible job he's doing with the economy. And for all we know, the Fed did this to crash the stock market so the Democrats could campaign on it going into the midterm elections because they're desperate. It wouldn't be the first time in U.S. history that the economy was manipulated to either benefit or attack an incumbent. In the past, there have been many occurrences where the Federal Reserve would flood the economy with all kinds of money, and everybody had cash, and everybody felt great, and they voted the incumbent party in. And if the Federal Reserve and their ilk don't like Donald Trump, they could play the game exactly the reverse. But it was a bad day on the Dow. Okay. You've been hearing about Sears. Iconic brand, historical. I mean, I'm 66. I remember when I was a kid, a little kid, getting that Sears catalog and looking at all the cool stuff that you could buy. Sneaking a peek at the lingerie pages when my parents weren't around. And Sears has hired a bunch of experts to prepare their bankruptcy. And they're filing for Chapter 11 debt for equity reorganization. But they're being pressured by their creditors to go for a Chapter 7 liquidation. In other words, Sears creditors are saying, don't bother trying to reorganize. Don't bother trying to keep the stores open. You're done. Just sell it all. get out of your leases, sell the properties, liquidate the inventory, get as much money as you can, and we'll take that. So again, you cannot look at all these iconic retailers in the United States that are collapsing and think that we have a working economy or an economy in recovery. It's just not there. Along with the homeless problem, the massive unemployment that they're still lying to you about. Interestingly enough, as you know, the U.S. has been hurling accusations at China over currency manipulation. And Christine Lagarde over at the International Monetary Fund has basically come forward to say that no, from where they sit, they're not seeing any evidence that China is manipulating its currency to gain a competitive advantage. So I guess China's off the hook on that one here. Most of the losses yesterday and today were in the tech stocks. And 80% of technology stocks are already in a correction. They're down 10% from their highs. We're going to take a break for station identification, and we'll be right back after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And taking an objective look at what's going on with the economy. The stock market has had a bad 2 days. There's been problems in the bond market. The dollar appears to be falling. And I would say, taken together, that's an indication that something big is on the horizon. Apparently, over at Bank of America, they're expecting a 30% correction to the stock market. And that is pretty serious numbers. Now, Ron Paul, of course, said he thinks it's 50%. I hope B of A is right. All right, we're going to take a phone call. Jim in Chicago, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Michael. Everyone's talking about the Saudi reporter that probably was murdered in the Saudi embassy in Turkey.
He's Turkish.
The one thing that no one's talking about... Say it again, please.
The reporter himself is Turkish.
Oh, he's Turkish. I thought he was Saudi.
No.
Oh, okay.
That's why the Turkish government is making a big stink about this.
Okay, I'm glad to clarify that. But no one's... Did you hear about the American civilian who went to... He's a citizen, by the way. He went to Egypt to visit his relatives, and while there, the Egyptian army kidnapped him for 4 months, tortured him, sodomized him, and basically beat the hell out of him. And you don't hear anything about that.
No, you don't. Again, corporate media filters the news, and I'm wondering why they're putting this pressure on Saudi Arabia right now at a time when Saudi Arabia is doing the U.S. dirty work in Yemen. Crown Prince bin Salman is cozying up to Israel, and the United States is going to need Saudi Arabia for when they go to war against Iran. So I think, obviously Turkey has instigated this. It would have been nice if somebody in the U.S. government had made a big stink about this guy who went to Egypt. But Egypt is a friend, so we don't say bad things about them. And this is a consistent pattern. The United States has allies which are dictatorships, and they're very brutal dictatorships, but you never hear anything about it because we're supposed to all be friends. The only time human rights and torture come up is when they're propagandizing us to get us ready to invade another country.
Right. I really do believe that the Egyptians would not have done that to an American citizen without America's permission, such as the CIA or other illegal groups.
Well, my guess is that for them to him of being a spy, and maybe that's another reason why the story never made the corporate media. Maybe he was a spy. Maybe he was a CIA asset or something.
Well, I read in The Guardian, they said they thought he was working for ISIS.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I read this morning. But either way, if you're an American citizen kidnapped by another country, I thought, isn't that country supposed to let the consulate know or something?
Absolutely.
And this,
It's a very serious business. And not only do they let the consulate know, but the diplomatic personnel are supposed to have full authority to visit with their national, which was also a rule that was violated in the Skripal case, where the Russian diplomats wanted to see Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal, and as far as we can tell, except for the one very obviously staged interview with Yulia, they're still being held incommunicado.
Right. And this is one of the reasons why I don't travel overseas anymore. You don't know what's going to happen to you. And not only that, I know America would not have my back if I did get into trouble one way or another.
Well, that would that's...
Well, Michael,
you know who I'm really angered by is Australia, who have stood by during this whole thing with Julian Assange, who is an Australian citizen, and they've done little more than wag their finger in support of him.
Right. Well, Michael, you take care.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go, and the phone lines are open. Getting on back to the economic news, apparently the rate at which the world is decoupling from the Federal Reserve note, otherwise known as the almighty dollar, is starting to accelerate. And more countries, they don't want to have to go through the dollar. They don't want to deal with the dollar. It's still a majority reserve currency, but by no means supreme. And that's another indicator that things are heading in a bad direction here. Right now, we're coming up in the holiday season. We've got Halloween here in a couple of weeks, and we've got Thanksgiving, and then we have Christmas, and then we have New Year's. And in times past, in good economic times, people would travel. It's a time to go see family. But it's not going to be happening as much this time. According to this article out of Zero Hedge, an estimated 33 million Americans won't be traveling during the holidays because they simply cannot afford to. And of course, that will have a ripple effect throughout the rest of the economy. It will mean reduced airline ticket sales, reduced hotel bookings for those who are driving where they're going to go or would be driving where they're going to go, means less gasoline sales. And it's another indicator. The economy is really not working for anybody except those at the top and the war machine. We're going to do a shout out now to our honor affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. Apparently over in Switzerland, there was this case where this ex-banker, Rudolf Elmer, who's the former chief operating officer of Bank Julius Baer in the Cayman Islands, and he blew the whistle on some of the things that were going on down there. And the bank's supporters basically sued him, and he has been acquitted because Switzerland does have laws that protect whistleblowers. Our country used to have laws that protect whistleblowers. They've all gone away. Corporations and governments don't like whistleblowers. They want to keep their little secrets here. I remember right after the crash of TWA 800, whistleblower protection for all the naval forces involved in the recovery was immediately revoked, which tells you something right there. As of now, U.S. crude oil exports to China have zeroed out. Chinese refiners just don't want to buy U.S. crude oil. They're going to other sources like Russia. And it's just another example of how this trade war that Trump has started is having unforeseen circumstances, because oil products were not on the tariff list. But the Chinese oil refineries said, no, we're not going to do that. There are probably other products that China buys from the United States that are not subject to tariff. They may start looking for alternative sources. Story out of Russia today. The U.S. Treasury is issuing more bonds to feed the soaring U.S. national debt, but they're having trouble finding people to buy them. And bond dealers have been buying more U.S. debt, but they're quickly reselling it, trying to make a profit. Now, last week's data showed the U.S. budget deficit soared to an estimated $782 billion in Trump's first full fiscal year as president. That's the largest fiscal deficit for the U.S. since 2012. And there are concerns the U.S. debt is growing out of control. What do you mean there are concerns? It is out of control. America's debt currently stands at $21.5 trillion. And the U.S. government paid $523 billion with a B in interest alone in fiscal 2018. Now, little thought experiment. If we still had the economic system this country was started with, without a private central bank, there would be no interest on being paid to this bank for having created this money out of thin air. And, of course, during the Civil War, Lincoln did that. He went with his greenbacks, which was as much a fantasy as the Federal Reserve note. There wasn't really anything backing it, but it worked. It funded the war without plunging the nation into debt to the bankers, and worked for the Reconstruction. And it worked so well, Lincoln announced he was going to keep that system going. And that may have been one of the motives for his assassination here. Over at Cryptagon, very interesting little article, very revealing here. In a departure from generally accepted accounting principles, federal agencies will be permitted to publish financial statements that are altered so as to protect information on classified spending from disclosure. In other words, it's now official. They're going to be lying to you again about where your money's going. Of course, we knew they were lying to us all the time anyway here. New study has come on out showing that half of American renters are struggling with unaffordable housing costs. And again, people have to have a way to trade their labor for decent wages and salaries in order to have a decent life. But it looks like the entire middle and lower class were basically down to almost a starvation regime. We're working hard as we can, and everything that we take in immediately goes back out for rent and taxes, and there's nothing left over. The surplus from our labor is going to the 1%ers who keep working to lower wages and salaries, and of course to the mighty war machine here. So let's talk about immigration and the refugee crisis. The other day, there was the debate about, is the wall going to be built? And the Democrats are saying, no, it'll cost too much. And then somebody pointed out that it's actually costing the United States more to pay for the hospital care for the illegal immigrant babies being born in the United States. And this article over at 12160 came out with an even more stunning statistic. There are more anchor baby births in Los Angeles than the total U.S. citizen births in 14 states. Each of these anchor baby births costs U.S. taxpayers $12,000. That's $2.5 billion annually, per the estimated 330,000 illegal births across the United States. The situation is totally out of control. It's totally out of control here. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is abusing what's called the Constitution-Free Zone, and they're back in court over it. First of all, I don't agree with the idea of a Constitution-Free Zone, which is defined as 100 miles in from national borders, which for the state of Hawaii means everywhere, because we're not that big. But apparently, the Department of Homeland Security placed a GPS device on a truck crossing into the United States from the Canadian border, And FBI agents then tracked it all the way down into California outside the Constitution-free zone. And it turned out all the truck had was legal frozen pastries, 4 bags of sugar. And the FBI claimed, well, this was just a trial run for actual drug busts. But the judge basically said, no, you didn't have a warrant. And you can't just go out of that Constitution-free zone and start searching people and tracking people without a warrant. So at least we still have some judges who are upholding the rule of law. Over in Great Britain, Robert Peston has made the claim that there is already a secret Brexit deal that's been agreed to by all parties. And the gist of the deal is it would temporarily keep Great Britain in the European Union's customs union, which means Great Britain would be unable to sign its own trade deals. They're still pushing for Brexit in name only. The globalists are not giving up. They are not giving up. Now, over at the American Music Awards, they just had them, like so many of these other gratuitous, self-congratulatory award shows we're seeing, Emmys and Oscars and everything, their ratings have plummeted. And they hit a record low. And I think part of it is the fact that people really do get tired of seeing stars congratulate themselves about how wonderful they are. But this article is saying it really is the politics. That everywhere you turn on any show, politics is being shoved at you, and the American audience is tuning it out. And they don't want to tune into these award shows because they're afraid they're going to sit there and have more liberal hysterics shoved at them. Here's a story that came out from Mommy Underground. And I think we mentioned this about 2 weeks ago, but it's worth mentioning it again. There was this student who was editor of the school newspaper, and he wrote an op-ed saying that gender is not fluid, that men and women have different body parts, and that's what determines your gender. And of course, the LGBT activists went totally ballistic on him and got him fired from his job as the editor, and forced him to resign from several other organizations. But the guy told the truth. Men and women are physically different. It really is getting insane out there. And we're still hearing about this situation. Karen White. Now, Karen White identifies as a woman, but she, he, it, who knows, is a man. He is beginning the transition, which means he still has a perfectly working male sausage. But he was, because he identified as a woman, thrown into the women's prison where he raped 2 women. This country has lost their senses. Over at Ohio University, there's a student, Anna Ayers. She's a journalism major and a member of the Student Senate at Ohio University, claimed she found threatening notes. She was receiving death threats and made a big deal about it. The Student Senate had a special sessions where she got up there and got to respond and rant and rave and, you know, how proud she was to be gay, and no amount of threats were going to get her to change her mind. The police, on investigating, discovered she sent the threats to herself. So she's been charged with making 3 false reports to police. That's a first-degree misdemeanor. She faces a maximum penalty of 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine for each charge. But when you look at how previous hate crime hoaxes have been treated, she's probably going to get a wrist slap. Okay. Here we have another story. This is coming from Brown University, where the university is saying students can now identify as people of color even if they're white. And the reason they did it is because of complaints that the admissions departments are biased towards certain groups, like Asian Americans, who tend to be smart. And so on the college application, you're allowed to mark any category that you think will get you in there. I mean, Elizabeth Warren would have really loved that. I have a better idea. If you want to make the nationality or ethnicity of the students irrelevant to the admission process, don't put it in there. Just take that whole thing out. But instead, they went the other way. You're allowed to identify as a person of color, even if you're white. That really is silly. All right. We're going to be right back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And a listener has sent in a correction regarding this Khashoggi who has vanished into the Saudi consulate. Apparently, he is a Saudi Arabian national, but he had sought refuge in Turkey. And he was also a writer for the Washington Post, which is why the U.S. corporate media is hot on this story as well. So thank you for the clarification on that one. Getting on back to political correctness. As you know, we're coming up on Halloween, and people like to dress up. But apparently over at Kent University, their student union has set up guidelines for what is acceptable or unacceptable attire for events where one would wear costumes. And apparently the ban includes cowboy hats, sombreros, and Stetsons because they might be offensive to cowboys. Apparently they're prohibiting their students from donning what is called chav clothing. And they just went down this whole list of outfits that could threaten other students with the right to a safe space at our university. Apparently, the only costumes that are allowed are cave people, aliens, ancient Greeks and Romans, and doctors and nurses. That's it. That's all you're allowed to dress up as. And I'm waiting for them to get nasty letters from the cave people about how offended they are about that. By the way, little bit of trivia. What most people think of as a cowboy hat is actually a product of the film industry. And if you go back and you look at antique photos of real cowboys, you will find they did not wear these hats with the very wide brims because they were impractical. The wind would blow them off. In fact, most cowboys wore what looked like bowler hats. The Sundance Kid wore a bowler hat. He never wore a cowboy hat that you would think of. A lot of what we think about history has just come out of the movies, and it's a lot of fictional stuff. Okay, there is a documentary out here, and it's called the Gosnell film. Gosnell, the Trial of America's Biggest Serial Killer. And it's actually a film about abortion. And Tom Arnold basically just went ballistic and tried to bully Dean Cain and attack him about the film. And then after he was off the show, just piled on the abusive tweets. Well, that's okay, because that's going to only call more attention to this film about abortion. It's going to be the Banned in Boston effect. Sometimes these liberals don't seem to understand the dynamic, that when they go on the attack against somebody or something or a film, it's going to increase public curiosity. Gee, what's the fuss all about? I need to go see that. By the way, little story you may not be aware of. Roe versus Wade was passed because the plaintiff, or the petitioner, if you will, claimed she had been raped and therefore had a right to an abortion. That's what led to the passage of Roe versus Wade. Later on live television, she admitted it was a lie. She made it all up. I keep hoping that the Las Vegas shooting is going to fade away, but more stuff keeps leaking out. Apparently, there is buried in the actual police report a revelation that there was this woman who was a TSA security employee, and she's at the back of the concert half an hour before the shooting takes place, and she sees these other two women talking about the coming shooting and how it's going to be like fish in a barrel. And they were actually making a video of themselves saying all this stuff. And the first woman says, those stupid blank white people, they're going to know how it feels. They deserve this. Wait until later. The second woman says, yo, like shooting fish in a barrel. Are you getting this, baby? I love you. So police, of course, have never followed up with the women described by the TSA employee. That thing was a hoax. There's just no two ways about it. All right, let's talk a little bit about computers and computer equipment. Amazon, boy, they're dealing with a lot of problems right now. Amazon is really big into artificial intelligence, and they set up a recruitment tool to go through job applications and make recommendations for hires. And the AI learned the job going through 10 years of resumes sent to the company, of which the vast majority were submitted by men. And as a result, the AI started basically biasing against women. So Amazon has now shut that down. And it raises a problem with AI, which I will elucidate when we come back from these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. And we're talking about computers. And before the commercial break, we were talking about how Amazon was using artificial intelligence in this recruitment tool that turned out to dismiss female candidates as a negative, because the 10 years of resumes that were used to train it were mostly submitted by men. And it raises a very serious problem with AI, because artificial intelligence is supposed to be a computer program which learns, which is able to basically develop and grow its own knowledge base. But what happens if it's learning something wrong? It's not like you can slap its wrist and say that was a bad thing. And especially in a lot of areas, how would you know that what's coming out of the AI is wrong? There's a real weakness in the current state of the art. And I say that because one of the apps I have on my iPhone is the Weather Channel, which works with Watson, which is IBM's AI, which is supposed to be learning how to produce more and more accurate weather forecasts, which I acknowledge up front are very, very difficult. But the Weather Channel, at least out here in Hawaii, it's notoriously bad in terms of, you'll start out in the morning, there's going to be thunder showers all day, and there's no thunder showers. And they keep moving it back and saying, well, the thunder showers are going to start at 1 in the afternoon. You get to 1 in the afternoon, no thunder showers. It's kind of like those airport signs when they don't want to admit that the plane is late, so they keep cheating that arrival time. It's kind of like that. What if the AIs are coming to incorrect conclusions? How do you know? How do you double check that? That's something I think ought to be looked at, especially now that we're hearing all this talk about applying AI to military operations, which just scares the heck out of me. Speaking of Halloween, somebody just wrote on in to say that Amazon is currently loaded with anti-Kavanaugh items, and 2 items for Ford, a shirt that says I believe, and a Christine Blasey Ford wig. And all the items for Kavanaugh are negative and related to his drinking and squeezing women. So Amazon is revealing its bias there. Another black eye for Amazon. This is being reported over in The Sun, which normally I would not link to, but the story was just too good to pass on. It may surprise you that Amazon, among its many other products, sells sex toys. And among those sex toys are sex dolls. And some of those sex dolls look very childlike. Now, they're not advertised as being children, but if you look at them, yeah, it's pretty much there. And, groups are slamming Amazon for having these out there. It's almost like they're encouraging child sexual abuse. And I absolutely agree. It's disgusting. It is really disgusting. And again, with Amazon, as you know, a lot of their workers are very disgruntled. Amazon announced a $15 minimum wage bump for 250,000 employees last week, but then took away their bonuses and profit sharing. So I guess Amazon has decided that they don't want to deal with the human workers anymore, and they are developing a fleet of picking robots to staff the warehouses, known as the fulfillment centers. And the robot pickers designed by Kindred Systems, and they grab items from the shelves and put them into bins before they're prepped and shipped. And the new robots will be able to visually identify items as they speed down a conveyor belt, then pick them up with a compressed air vacuum gripper before moving them onto a table or shelf. And so you're going to have a lot of Amazon workers out of a job. And we're heading on down that road where the consumer economy is going to crash because everything is automated. Nobody has a job. Nobody has money to go in and buy these products. And that's why companies like Sears are going out of business. They like to blame it's all on e-commerce. And yes, Amazon's doing a brisk business. But it's really a tiny fraction of the total consumer spending. And a lot of people are saying Amazon has actually become a destructive force in our society. Over at the New York Post, they have an article, "Break Up Amazon Before It Does Any More Damage to America." And they're talking about the aftermath of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And the corporate media, of course, lauded it. It's the just thing, good for them. And, of course, the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, just treated him like he was a hero, like the second coming. But again, if you go past that $15 minimum wage, it costs these workers bonuses and stock profit sharing plans. So, when did we become the United States of Amazon? Researchers are saying that so far, there is no evidence at all that Russia is messing with campaign 2018. That the article just goes on in to remind everybody about Russia's interference in the 2016 election, which, again, is unproven. There's no evidence there. The article also makes reference to Russia stealing the DNC emails, which they did not. It was an internal leak, most likely by Seth Rich. Sometimes I think these prostitutes and correspondents, they'll get an idea into their head, they'll write about it, and they never question it again. They're not willing to question it again. They're not willing to look bad by saying, I made a mistake on thus and such. Now, you know, there was a recent problem with the Windows 10 October update. There was something in it that was deleting files, just totally deleting them, making them go, no way to recover them. Although, actually, I saw an ad for a piece of software that allows you to locate and recover those files here. Here is the interesting part. Apparently, when the update went out to the insiders, the people who test these things, a lot of them reported back, this is deleting files. And Microsoft released it anyway. Also, apparently, with this October update, it's causing BSODs on Hewlett-Packard computers. Just locks them up. And I understand that Microsoft wants to make more money for their owners and stockholders, and they're not going to want to pay people to test these products more thoroughly, especially because they've got people who volunteer to do it. But I think a big issue here for the entire computer industry is we've allowed them to become way too complex and hence unmanageable. And because they are so complex, it just opens up more opportunities for cybercrime. I think we need to go back to a simpler platform that basically resets itself every time you turn it on to clean out any malware or other problems that are there, like the way the Apple II did or the Commodore 64 did. And just make it easier to use, easier to take care of. We spend all of our time patching. I want to actually do real work. I don't want to. If I'd wanted a future in computer maintenance, I would have gone to computer maintenance school. I want my machines to work for me, not the other way around. Alrighty. Crypto mining is now the top cybersecurity threat. It has now become a bigger problem than ransomware, although obviously it doesn't cost you, the end user, as much money as ransomware. But it's eating up computer cycles, it's eating up internet bandwidth, and Webroot basically came out with their mid-year threat report update and said cyber attack vectors are being increasingly advanced and sophisticated to basically hijack your machine and turn it into a cryptocurrency mining system. Now, in the long run, this is going to backfire because we're seeing all the cryptocurrencies lose value. I think they're off by something like 70%. And the reason is simple. The more of a currency you create out of thin air, and let's be honest, cryptocurrencies are created out of thin air, the less it's worth. And the crypto miners could easily find themselves broke with worthless cryptocurrencies. Nobody will want to buy them because the value keeps going down. You know, it's the big question. What do you do when you have hijacked a bunch of machines and you've got 2 million cryptocurrency coins and nobody wants to buy them from you? What was the whole point of the exercise here? Okay. If you are like me, you probably get a constant barrage of robocalls that are equipped with a spoofed number for caller ID to make it sound like it's somebody near where you live. I get those all the time. Apparently last November, the Federal Communications Commission created the 2017 call blocking order, which is supposed to provide phone companies a means of weeding out and blocking robocalls. But apparently, the attorneys generals in 35 states have observed the problem is getting worse, despite the order. In 2017, the Federal Trade Commission received 4.5 million complaints about robocalls. And again, it looks like the FCC went through the motions of saying, yes, we're going to pass this rule. It's not being enforced. And unfortunately, that's become a common feature of the government. They'll pass a rule, they'll pass a law, but nothing ever actually gets done, because that would be too much work. Okay, we're going to take a phone call from John in Rancho Cucamonga. And aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, real quick. Right before the 2:30 break, you were talking about a shooting in which you mentioned that there were some women who were texting or sending videos back and forth on their cell phones, talking about how they were, doing things to set up the shooting.
Well, basically,
which shooting was that?
The Las Vegas shooting, the Mandalay Bay shooting.
Oh,
and this was all happening half
right.
an hour before the shooting actually started, and it apparently is actually in the police report.
Yeah, I heard that part too. That's outrageous.
Somebody messed up.
Have you put an article together on your website to that effect?
Not yet. I linked to the article from my main page. You can find it there if you want to look at it.
Okay, and what was your source for that? Do you know offhand?
I've already deleted it from my talking points. I'd have to go back and look.
Oh, okay.
But okay. You can find it at whatreallyhappened.com.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Mike.
All right. Thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go. Over in Belgium, they're dealing with what's called the porcine plague, meaning pigs are getting very, very ill. And suspicion is beginning to fall on the Pentagon biowarfare experiments being conducted down in Georgia, because apparently they're having problems with their pig farms there as well. It's rapidly spreading across the globe, and there's a concern that something may have accidentally leaked out of this laboratory that is causing this illness, which of course is going to disrupt the food supply. Okay. If you are a smoker, you may have been noticing these new e-cigarettes, and a lot of people have switched over to the e-cigarettes on the theory that they're healthier for you. They don't have as many of the bad chemicals, which certainly seems to be true. But apparently there is an issue with the flavored e-cigs, because those chemicals that give it the flavor are apparently very inflammatory to the lungs. So you might want to be very careful about that. Over in New York City, count them, 5 doctors have been charged over an illegal prescription drug mill, dishing out millions of opioids without even examining the patients. The patients just came on in and said, I need a prescription for this. The doctor wrote it on out. It was a prescription mill. And again, we've seen that happen before, but Manhattan is going to prosecute them. And these were doctors Carl Anderson, Dante Kubangbang, Nikanga, Anthony Pietropinto, and Nadam Saya have been accused of running an illegal prescription drug mill that resulted in multiple deaths and several overdoses. Now, the opioid crisis is very real, and it is getting out of control. And the reason we have an opioid crisis is because the opium is very cheap for the pharmaceutical companies to acquire. And why is it cheap for the pharmaceutical companies to acquire? Well, because the United States invaded one of the world's best sources of opium poppies, Afghanistan. So we've got product. Let's push the product. Over in Hungary, there's been a repeat of something that happened some years ago, where farm fields contaminated with GMO are being burned down. And this, of course, is an act of defiance against Monsanto and the United States. And basically, the planting of GMO crops is currently illegal in Hungary and in 26 other countries around the world. In at least 50 countries, GMOs are required to be labeled. Meanwhile, in America, the USDA has disallowed GMO labeling and is promoting the continued commercialization of genetically modified crops. Monsanto has entrenched itself within the American political and legal systems, influencing politicians to sell out the environment and your health for profit. And that's life underneath fascism. We got to take a break for commercials. Back after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're going to take one more phone call here, and that's from James in Ohio. Aloha, James. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi. Tomorrow, Trump's going to be in my town about a mile away from my home, so I sent you a link to a David Knight video from Friday where he interviews Alex Newman about NAFTA 2, and apparently it's like the globalist wish list. And the segment before that, he interviewed a guy about climate change and indicates Trump hasn't gotten us out of the UN climate change treaty either. So I was thinking about going up there and representing the view of the other group of people that wear black, we're all black, which is that it's beginning to look like the only way all these decisions and lack of decisions on Trump's part make sense is if we were being played from before the beginning. So I'll let you know
Trump
how
is a
that.
disappointment. Trump is absolutely a disappointment. There's no question about it.
Yeah, I do understand the principle of all the people who slavishly continue to follow him. You know, they're the low information voters now.
Good phrase for them. Unfortunately, and again, I'm very glad Hillary did not win in 2016. I dread the fact that she may be running in 2020. But Trump has been a disappointment, and I honestly can't call myself a Trump supporter as much as a Trump observer. Right.
It's the way I explain it to people is, to no good end is that these things he's doing, he's not making compromises or trades for something of value. He's just giving our butts away, basically.
Yeah, especially to Israel.
It always falls on deaf ears. Yeah, that's the other thing, Israel. Unfortunately, I think I can only get one message across on a protest sign, but I'll let you know how it goes.
Well, if you go, take pictures and send them, and I'll blur your face and post them on whatreallyhappened.com. Excuse me.
Right.
Okay, we're going to let you go. The phone lines are closed. And I want to remind everybody, I'm only doing the first 2 hours of today's show live, so I'm coming up on my end of this portion of the program. For hour number 3, we're going to be replaying the interview we did with Tom Kaczynski, who was author of the book, The Coming Civil War. And a lot of people responded very positively to that interview. And I think it's timely, given all of these liberals who are out there screaming for violence in the streets. Because they are turning into a violent mob. And the next step past violent mob is civil war. And so Tom definitely, he had a lot of really good information. So I would invite you to stay for hour number 3 and rehear that interview. And then after that, of course, stay tuned for John Stadmiller, who's going to have a lot more interesting things to share with you as well. So right now, I got to go take Claire to the doctor place, and we'll be back tomorrow with Claire. Aloha, America. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. And joining us on the phone is Tom. And Tom, I don't even want to try and pronounce your name for fear I will botch it. How do you pronounce your last name?
Kaczynski. How are you doing tonight?
Just simply Kaczynski. Okay. I'm doing great, and thank you for joining us here. Now, you're the author of a new book, The Coming Civil War, and I don't like the idea that we might see a civil war in this country, on the streets of America, but there are so many people who are talking about it as it being potential. I thought it might be worthwhile to bring you on the show and allow you to share your prognostications and insights on this subject. So can we start by just giving us a little bit of an overview of what the book talks about?
Sure. The book really goes into some of the reasons that are driving us into conflict. And the core thesis of the book is that we're already in a sort of cultural civil war where we have two rapidly dividing camps in America between people who think America was a good idea, who represent traditional heritage, identity, faiths, whatnot. You could call it the conservative faction if you like. And then you have a progressive faction that wants to unmake and undo America, that's committed to using government in every way, including ways that are far beyond a constitutional mandate to accomplish that. And they keep importing more people in from other countries and supporting open borders policies with the explicit intent of changing the population, to change the voting habits, to change the laws. And the sad thing is, my personal belief is you can't have a country where you are multicultural and have different ideas of what represents truth, beauty, and righteousness, where the population is perpetually divided against itself and have it hold together. So while I don't know if the civil war that emerges is going to be a hot military war, what I absolutely believe is that we need to get to a point as Americans as having one set of cultural ideals that is dominant. Otherwise, the country will not be able to sustain itself.
I absolutely agree, and I think we're certainly heading for a period where we're going to see a lot of violence in the streets. I mean, look what happened to Ted Cruz at that restaurant, where liberals are literally being encouraged to confront on the border of violence conservatives. And at one point, did they cross the line where somebody gets seriously hurt, or worse, they get killed? And I'd like to find a way back from all of this, but it does seem as if both sides are intractable, or even more so, the liberals are caught up in this utopian fantasy that they can actually make a much better country if everybody just does things their way, which obviously I don't agree with. The whole idea of having a free country is that everybody's free to mind their own business and live their own lives as long as they're not hurting each other. But this totalitarian regime that seems to be emerging within our midst, it's going completely the other way. And there's a lot about modern liberalism, which does remind me of the former Soviet Union in terms of, constant surveillance, control over every little single aspect of our lives. We've gone from a society where you could do anything that you wanted if the government didn't forbid it, to a society where you can't do anything until the government gives you permission. And that's a bit of a shock. Now, for younger people, they may just think it's the way it's always been. When you're my age, you understand, no, in point of fact, we have lost a very great deal of what made the United States such a great nation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's funny you say that. The first book I wrote was called Someone Had to Say It, The Hidden History of How America Was Lost, and it went into exhaustive detail about how the subversion of American culture and American government was quite deliberate. And we see from the 60s onward the effort where the left took control of all the cultural centers of our country, whether it's professors on universities, whether it's the mainstream media, which started out with the press and the papers, or whether it's the big tech companies today. One of the things that makes it so difficult for us to compete is that we see more and more that right-wing voices are being isolated, that they're being demonetized, deplatformed, and all of the opportunities for us to have civic discourse and to debate issues logically are being shut down by the left, as they, having lost a battle of trying to do that the right way, have reached this point where they think the only way they can win is through censorship, control, and totalitarian efforts that are more reminiscent of Stalin than anything else.
Yeah, very, very much so here. And it is a very one-sided discussion. And what was it John F. Kennedy used to say? When peaceful revolution becomes impossible, violent revolution becomes inevitable. And I think the logic behind that applies to this push toward a very divided society. And unlike the original Civil War, where there was a clearly demarcated line on which these were the good guys and these were the bad guys, depending upon your point of view, it's almost like the potential combatants in a new Civil War are blended together. They're homogenized. And because you have liberals and conservatives pretty much everywhere, although the liberals tend to be on the coastal areas and the conservatives tend to be in the heartland. But then you've got the refugee issue, the illegal immigrants. It's all been blended together. If actual violence starts, breaking out, where are going to be the borders of it? Or is it just going to explode everywhere?
Well, it's very hard to say because it won't be like the first Civil War in that you have states, but there are sort of boundaries. The book goes into 4 different vectors, let's say, on which the fighting may occur. And people understand left versus right. That's pretty simple. And there is a racial component to this, because what will happen is you look who votes different ways. It's pretty easy to predict that whites are going to vote Republican and non-whites overwhelmingly don't vote Republican. There is a culture issue between Christians, traditionalists, people who respect American heritage versus progressives, Muslims, and items like that. But to answer your specific question, one thing I identified in writing this book is that the biggest gap in the country is between the city and the rural areas. And so if you want to think what the lines might look like should a fight break out, what I suspect you would find is the cities would be under siege from the country folk who would no longer send them the goods they need to survive. And if you look at it from a leftist perspective, just think about this for a second, because you were talking about Ted Cruz being assaulted. How many cities are basically in their own miniature form of secession now by refusing to deport people who do not belong there, by having illegal sanctuary city laws and having selective enforcement where if an Antifa hoodlum comes down and commits violence, they won't be prosecuted. But if a right-wing prayer warrior were to be indicted, he'll be thrown in jail for 10 years. It's crazy, but no one's calling this out because we're so used to looking at things at the federal level. We don't see the breakaway already happening below us between the culture, the universities, and these big cities that are overwhelmingly run and have been destroyed by Democrats.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the same thing with the universities as well. I think one issue is that, unfortunately, and this was true even before the deplatforming began on social media, is that conservatives, by and large, tend to be kind of quiet people, whereas the liberals have been encouraged to just become more and more vocal, screaming, crying, whining, tantrum. And as a result, they tend to draw more attention to their particular position, and conservatives are kind of being left behind. Certainly the bias in the corporate media doesn't help that either. But I think conservatism is definitely underrepresented in the public consciousness right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And it's an amazing thing because there's a market there of 100 to 180 million Americans that just is not served. And it's sort of crazy when we look at our system that we don't have more people out speaking to the conservative cause. The good news is, though, that the liberal overreach that we see is really revealing how they would govern and how they like to rule. And I think a lot of people are being motivated now to stand up against what the left is offering. And in the short term, I'd have to say the terrible way in which Brett Kavanaugh is being slurred and slandered is going to wake up a lot of Republicans and conservatives who maybe got a little complacent with all the success that Trump was offering. And I think people need to realize we don't have the numbers or the time to just sit back and let things happen. We need to go ahead and do whatever we can to go ahead and ensure that this government has a workable majority and to use that majority in such a way to act aggressively. And I say that because the big fear that I have, having researched this carefully for the coming Civil War, is that if conservatives just sit back and let the left do for the next 30 years what they did for the last 30 years, our children will be living in Venezuela, and I don't think anybody wants that.
Well, I would agree with you on that one. Our children may actually be sent to Venezuela sooner than that because they're talking invasion. But I digress. I think one of the things that we need to keep focus on, yes, the way that Kavanaugh is being treated is reflecting very badly on the Democrats. I'm concerned that they're convinced they're going to steal the election in November, and that's why they're willing to behave like this, because they don't think it's going to have an impact on them. But if the Republicans want to have a chance in the midterms, they got to stand up to the Democrats, and they've got to do it right now. If they don't push through the vote and confirm Kavanaugh right now, they'll be seen as bad and corrupt as the Democrats by the voters, and the advantage they have coming out of the confirmation hearing will be pretty much erased. And what's amazing is I'm not seeing any kind of really decisive leadership on the GOP side. Over on the Democrat side, you've got all these people who are out there whining and crying, like Maxine Waters and Dianne Feinstein. But on the conservative side, I understand they want to try and maintain a sense of decorum and dignity. And I also understand that people on the conservative side are being ignored pretty much by the media. But they need to get more aggressive. And I understand Mitch McConnell is on the point of losing his temper and saying the vote is going to go on through. But at this point, I almost think they've let the Democrats get away with way too much. And the American voter may be seeing them as weak.
I agree. I think it's unfortunate that the whole Republican Senate's been held hostage by the combination of Senators Collins, Murkowski, and Flake. And as someone who lives in Maine, I can say there is immense frustration up here with Senator Collins, and our apologies to the rest of the country for what she's doing. It's really unfortunate that a good man is having his name slurred and slandered, and that the Republican, Party is not working more aggressively on this, because I agree with you that the best thing they can do is to get Kavanaugh through. However, I do think there is one silver lining if this charade actually works, and the Republican Party will not deserve success if they cannot manage to put Kavanaugh through. But nonetheless, it will turn the midterm into a referendum on whomever will be the next election, and I suspect Trump, being the savvy politician he is, he will pick someone like Amy Barrett, perhaps, that would go ahead and get around the sort of sexual innuendo issues. And if you think about it, in races like Missouri against McCaskill, Manchin in West Virginia, or Tester in Montana, even though I think it's bad for the country to have the court be so politicized that we turn midterm elections into referenda, it might not work against them, even though it should. And I guess it goes back to that old dictum, it's better to be lucky than good. So I think there's some upside for the Republicans if things go poorly, but they certainly don't deserve it, and they shouldn't take the chance of something that is by no means a sure deal.
Well, yeah, because the midterms, I mean, we know how crooked the 2016 elections were. We know how the DNC literally stole the nomination away from Bernie Sanders. We watched how the Republican National Committee fought tooth and nail to keep Donald Trump from winning that nomination. And we also know there's a major problem, first of all, with election fraud itself and with illegal immigrant voting. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a brand new MIT Yale study that just came on out saying that the number of illegal immigrants currently in the United States of America is at 21 million. That's edging up on close to 10% of the population, and they're all going to be voting Democrat. And it astounds me. The thing I cannot figure out is Trump has to know that his supporters in 2016 fought tooth and nail, not just to get him the majority of the votes, but to get so many votes it would overwhelm the very obvious vote fraud that was being used against him. And knowing that election fraud is a problem, why has he not tackled this? I mean, he did start up that Election Integrity Commission, and then the commission went out to all these state election bureaus and ran into a brick wall, which right there is the giveaway. Something crooked is going on. So Trump just shuts it all down, and he hands election integrity to the Department of Homeland Security. All they're doing is saying we're going to make sure that nobody can hack into these electronic voting machines from Russia. But Russia isn't the one who was hacking into the electronic voting machines. It was much more local. So I don't understand why Trump doesn't realize that by not addressing this issue early on in his administration, he's handing the midterms to the Democrats, and he's going to be a one-term president.
I think that one of the real tragedies of the Trump administration to this point has been the complete failure of the Department of Justice to do anything except serve as a hindrance to what they're trying to accomplish. You know, if we had had more effective leadership from Attorney General Sessions and all the other people beneath him, we could have been investigating these questions and acting upon them. And I think it's a real lost opportunity that needs to have been handled very differently. I agree with you 1,000% that immigration is the motivating issues for Republican voters. I think one reason that Trump hasn't done it to this point has to do with moderate Republicans in Congress who think that the old formula to try to centralize and try to get a certain percentage of, suburban female voters is the way to go. And unfortunately, Trump, in this case, is a little bit hostage to the Congress. And to be honest with you, most Republicans who I talk to personally are incredibly frustrated that while they liked the tax bill, they weren't able to get any nationalist action, which is to say the border wall, immigration reform, or even the repeal of Obamacare, which was something every one of the people there had campaigned on, accomplished. And while I don't know if it's going to lead to Trump being a one-term president, I think I'm a little more optimistic than maybe you are, just because of how abhorrent the left will be if they get in power and what they'll do. I think it's an incredible lost opportunity at a time we don't need to have that. And Trump was given a mandate to show revolutionary leadership, and I can only hope and pray that he has some plan which we're not seeing, because what we've seen to this point isn't good enough.
I agree. I absolutely agree. He's been a huge disappointment. And again, the issue of immigration and the issue of election integrity are both issues Trump should have just started on right from day one. The other big mistake I think Trump made was coming into the White House. He wanted to be magnanimous in victory, and he allowed all these Obama holdovers to remain in their jobs. Now, I'm sure Trump, coming from the world of business, was thinking that, well, they'll be loyal to me now because I'm the new boss, and that may be the way it works in the world of business. That's not how it works in Washington, D.C. Trump should have gone into that executive office building and just scraped it out clean right to the walls and brought in all new people from outside the Beltway who are not compromised by their existing connections with the so-called deep state. My concern for the November elections is there's going to be massive fraud. They thought they had it in 2016. They thought Hillary was going to be it, and it took them by surprise when Trump won. And I think they're going to just double down their efforts this time. They're not going to let it get that close. And so, again, I'm disappointed Trump just dropped the ball on this.
Yeah, I agree with you about the election fraud. I remember election night in 2016 that, they were looking for more votes in Michigan, which seems to have infinite votes coming out of Detroit whenever they're needed. Like there were some districts, precincts where there were more votes cast than actual voters registered. And that's why that recount disappeared, because they realized they couldn't go through with it or they'd show the fraud. I think it's incredibly disturbing that we have electronic voting. It's disturbing who owns those companies like Diebold, the connections they have to people like the Soros Foundation. And I'll tell you something interesting that I've kind of learned.
Well, people
don't trust the process.
Tom, I'm sorry. I got to put you on hold. We got to take a break for commercials. And when we come on back in 3 minutes, we'll just pick right up on this topic. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And we're talking with Tom Kaczynski, author of the book, The Coming Civil War, which you can find at Amazon.com. And Tom, before we get back to the issue of election fraud, we have a caller on the line with a question. Art off the grid. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Mike. I'm kind of curious. I agree with you. At this point, I am of the opinion that Trump is definitely going to be a one-term president because of what we've seen thus far. Yes, he's done a few little oddball thingies here and there, but nothing that anybody I know of has really benefited from. But the big thing that sticks in the craw of myself and others that I know are, one, he talked about draining the swamp, and as you've stated, he goes in there and he keeps all these Obama holdovers. That's not draining the swamp. He talked about during the campaign he was going to, one of the first things he was going to do was have the Clintons and the Clinton Foundation investigated, and no sooner than he's declared the winner, he says, I think the Clintons have suffered enough, and he lets that one go. That was a big disappointment for a lot of people. And then he caves, and knowing full well, I would hope he would know, under the Constitution, he has the full authority to say, no, these people cannot come into the country, and he's got that authority to dictate, immigration. He's got that authority, but yet he
does.
lets Congress bully him into backing off.
Tom?
Yeah, so I agree with what the caller is saying here, and I think a lot of people are frustrated with that. I think one of the problems that Trump had when he came in there is that, as you said, he tried to be too magnanimous. But I think another problem was, he didn't have control over anything in the federal bureaucracy. And I'm not apologizing for Trump, but I'm saying that he should have, maybe like Andrew Jackson, come in with his own team ready to go and just go ahead and do things. But if the Congress wasn't willing to appoint his cabinet officials, run with a kitchen cabinet. And I think people wanted that sort of revolutionary leadership from President Trump. They haven't gotten it, and sometimes, the perfect is the enemy of the good. It would have been good had he kicked all those swamp dwellers out, and now we're stuck playing games that they love and they know best that are just eating up the months of this administration. But I think this is the problem, right? So people are going to watch and see someone like Trump get in there, who I think was legitimate in his intentions, at least, to speak to reform, and see how badly he failed in terms of being able to accomplish it to this point, and then say, well, if we can't even have any success when we elect a president, what other options are left to us? And that's one of the premises of the book, which is that if the right wants to succeed, it's going to have to be very aggressive in acting against these institutions. Like, to be honest with you, the FBI, the CIA, all these entities, they deserve to be heavily examined. The Fed should be audited. These are things Republicans have been talking about for 10 or 15 years, yet no one ever seems to want to do it because the donor class, which goes ahead and puts in the Republicans in the House and Senate, basically is part of a uniparty type system that really isn't representing the conservative views that many Americans hold.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of us, like the group that I run in, we're pretty knowledgeable about this. And we understand, as Colonel Allen West of Florida once said, the President of the United States is the CEO of a corporation known as the United States. And one of the reasons why we threw our weight behind Trump was because we're looking at a businessman who knows how to run a business, and who better to run a massive corporation than someone whose entire life was built upon wheeling and dealing. And anybody knows, I grew up in several different businesses. Between my mom and dad, they owned several businesses as I was growing up. And I know what it's like when you buy a company and you come in and you take it over. The first thing you do is you flip the staff. That's number one on the agenda. You get rid of everyone who's been a problem and you replace them. And there's nothing wrong with running on a skeleton crew. In fact, a skeleton crew sometimes can be much more effective than a full staff. And this is what we were hoping for, and this is not what we've seen. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the dialogue, and I'm looking forward to the next half hour.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the phone call, Art. And who was it who said that government governs best, that governs least? We have gone so far away from that wisdom, and government is huge, it's bloated, and sometimes it can't get out of its own way. More importantly, and this gets back to the FBI and the CIA and the Department of Justice, it's clearly factionalized with all of these various agencies thinking that really they should be in charge. And that's always been a risk with intelligence agencies. It goes all the way back to when the CIA was first being formed, and Harry Truman expressed his concerns about that as well. But when Trump came on in, he should have immediately replaced the heads of all of these departments and agencies. We have had, 3 attorney generals in a row now that absolutely will not look at the very real crimes being committed by liberals, but they're totally obsessed about doing whatever they can against conservatives, like this ridiculous Russiagate investigation. Anyway, Tom, we got to take another break for commercials, and we'll be right back after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're talking with Tom Kaczynski. He's the author of the book, The Coming Civil War. It's available at Amazon.com. And basically, Tom is saying the new Civil War is going to be vastly different than the first one, which was the blues and the grays and border. It's going to be more of factions spread all over the country at war with each other. And the cultural war is definitely well underway between liberals and conservatives. And you would think the liberals would be self-destructing at this point with some of the stuff they're coming out with, like, men can use the ladies' restrooms and 12 years olds can get sex change operations out in California. But somehow they continue to hang on, and they have the support of the corporate media and the corporate social media. But the friction is definitely building. We were seeing all this Antifa violence that were out there. And it's funny that they call themselves anti-fascists when they're working from the fascist playbook. So I agree with your earlier statement that the civil war in this country has already begun, although it's at the moment, very low key. But it does seem to be ramping on up. Now, you talked about 4 vectors before,
Yes.
of which one was, I think you said the first one was racial. Just give us an overview of the 4 vectors.
Sure. So the 4 vectors are ideology, which is left versus right, residency,
Yes.
which is city versus country, race, which is whites mostly against minorities mostly, and the other is traditionalist versus progressives. And here's the funny thing about it. Let's say things get to fighting, which we all pray it doesn't, but if it gets there and you don't know who are your friends and your enemies, you might know a couple of your neighbors, but that's it. What's going to happen is people are going to make a lot of assumptions based on stereotypes. It's a sane and rational thing to do when you have no other information. And so what you find is that even though these groups don't necessarily all work together or think the same way, if we have a cultural civil war where Christians are attacked, the people who will defend them are probably going to be white country folk who own guns and who go to church. Or if the Republican, if Trump, God forbid, was assassinated and there was an uprising, it would be Republicans who would be white country folk who own guns. And the same thing happens on the left. So what the unique thing this book realizes is that any one of these conflicts represents a fault line that is so heavily divided and where the lines line up so much between a group of 4 on one side and a group of 4 on the other side that we could end up in a fight very quickly because the left might want to pick the fight based on race and on their anti-white agenda that they go out there. Or the right might decide to pick the fight on, let's say passage in a future administration of limitations on the Second Amendment. But it doesn't really matter how the fight's picked because there's basically 2 groups of people. People who think America as it was good and we need to go back to that, and people who think America as it was bad and we need to transform it. And I don't know that you have an in-between ground that you can realize there. And what's really difficult is as that group of progressives gets larger and larger, and the book goes into the demographics of this, who's coming into this country, who's having children, birth rates, voting habits. All of the things suggest that the left will win this fight if the right doesn't act decisively in this moment to change how America works. And if Trump doesn't do it, someone is going to have to emerge behind him and quickly who will follow through on all the promises that he made and then some.
Yeah, I don't know who that might be. I mean, I was a big supporter of Ron Paul when he was trying to run for office. But as you know, our system is biased against third parties. And now we find out, because of 2016, that the party machinery is biased against the voters. And I remember when this whole big stink about Bernie Sanders came on out, Dianne Feinstein said it's perfectly okay for the party leadership to pick the candidate. Well, then why bother having primaries? That's what I want to know. They're just maintaining the illusion that we, the people, still have some control. But it's party politics. Again, like the old Soviet Union, the party picked the candidate, and by the time voters got to vote on anything, it was already decided. And we're seeing exactly the same system here. And as far as that middle ground goes, I think there could have been a middle ground. I'm obviously, raised in New England, raised conservative, but there are some things I think, progressives had some good ideas. I think the crisis that the left is facing today is they're out of really good ideas. And that's why they're coming up with all this wacko nonsense about, gender fluidity, and restrooms and this constant victimhood of just trying to find things to be offended about so they can go on the attack to try and silence conservatives because they've run out of ideas. But in the middle of it all, it does feel like our society is tearing itself apart, because when you have two parties and they have an election and everybody honors the result of the election, then you have a country. But if you have an election and the losing party is saying, no, we don't accept it, we're going to try and tear it down, then you are hovering at the edge of anarchy. And we saw since the Trump victory, they were having riots in cities. They've come up with this Russian nonsense. They're talking about the 25th Amendment. They are openly trying to bring down the duly elected president of the United States of America, and conservatives ought to be really outraged and voicing that outrage, because whether you agree with Trump or not, and I'll be the first to say I'm very disappointed in him, he did win the election, and we're supposed to be a nation that plays by the rules, but we seem to have lost that, primarily on the left as well, and we're seeing it again with this abysmal way that Kavanaugh is being treated, where Hawaii's Mazie Hirono was literally out there saying, no, we don't need a presumption of innocence. He doesn't get that. Forget due process. The word of the accuser is enough, and we've got to get rid of him. And they're just frothing at the mouth, trying to find some way to either get him out of there or delay his confirmation until after the first of the year on their assurance they'll then be in control of the Senate.
Well, I think there's a lot of really good points you made there, and I want to unpack two specifically. Number one is why they have these crazy social agendas. What the agendas do is they first are a huge distraction that divide people, and it keeps people from looking at the money. It keeps people thinking, oh, we need to fight over these issues. And it's funny how the solution every time there's a bad idea is to more government. And you see the left always say, let's make a committee for this, let's make a function for that. And the government now is involved in so many aspects of our lives that are, beyond even just constitutional authority, or completely beyond common sense. And yet the left uses its cultural influence to go ahead and attack and destroy anyone who speaks sanity to this insanity. I mean, most people think transgenderism should be treated as a mental disorder, and that these people shouldn't be receiving, money for operations. They should be serving treatment to understand that, men and women are the two genders. And we don't have that anymore. The second part that is disturbing to me is we were talking before the last break about elections and the voting machines. And an interesting survey, if you look after an election, in an election when the Democrats lose, 80% of Democrats believe the voting machines were fixed. After an election when the Republicans lose, about 85 to 88% of Republicans believe the election was fixed. So even though you won't ever get a poll where it says that 85% of Americans don't trust the voting machines, the reality is when people are stressed and pressed to look at the results that come up, if their side doesn't win, they don't believe in the process. And so when we have a deep state that doesn't serve the people, elections that are beyond questionable, candidates that are bought and sold, it's a question, how much can the American people take before they decide to take matters into their own hands? And given that we've had a failure of leadership in Washington, the reason I wrote my book was I realized that under these conditions, with all this division, if we face any severe challenge, whether it be natural, artificial, whether it's created from politics, or whether it could be just a bad enough disaster, I am not at all convinced that our country will be resilient enough to survive. And I think people need to be really aware of this and begin thinking in their own lives to have people around them they trust and they know, because if the left does come back into power, we've seen out of power how willing they've been able to go after conservatives and voices on the right generally. I can only imagine how much worse it will be when we have people like Loretta Lynch and Eric Holder, the next generation, coming back into power. And to say something that I've said in other places that's really controversial and blunt, I would rather take my chances on finding a different path forward than another 8 years under someone like Obama. And I don't know if other people feel that way, but I think that we've seen what that looks like. And we know that for the Constitution, the rule of law, and the protection of, our borders, that would be a death sentence.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. And again, the push for open borders is basically coming from two places. And the first one, of course, is George Soros, who's pushing for the one world government, new world order. And the strategy there is to just blur everyone together all over the United States, all over Europe, so that we lose our sense of cultural, regional identity. As far as the illegal immigrants pouring across that southern border, the Democrats literally are dependent on them to win the election. The Democratic leadership has openly said, yeah, we need these illegals to vote us back into power. And yet they're not supposed to do that. Again, it's against the law. And great that Donald Trump is starting to build the wall and everything, but under Title VIII, the laws already exist to deal with this problem. You were talking before about another committee, more government, so forth and so on. Every time there's a crisis, somebody says, we need a law to do X, Y, Z. No, we don't. We've got a lot of laws. They're not being enforced. And especially under Title VIII, if you were to just use Title VIII and just start shutting down all these people who are aiding and abetting the illegal immigrants, all those who are giving them employment, the laws are already on the books. And as far as the secessionist cities and states that are running the sanctuary cities, there's a section of Title VIII there where these mayors and governors can be arrested and thrown in jail. Now, is this issue going to lead to a point where we might actually see states start to secede over these different points of view? We know there's been a lot of talk about it in California. We know that Texas has been flirting with secession for a long time. We've got an independence movement going here in Hawaii, and I understand there's one up in Alaska, because we're all kind of getting fed up with all this nonsense coming out of, Sodom on the Potomac.
Well, and I'll tell you the truth, there are people who think that way up here in northern New England as well, because everyone is questioning why we keep investing all of our effort and energy into a system that just isn't working. And, with respect to the sanctuary cities and the people who are, existing in violation of Title VIII, I think that most Republicans and conservatives would support the Trump administration if they went ahead and took action against those officials which are not doing their lawful duty. But, this is the problem when the right comes into power. The left, when they come to power, are ruthless in how they go about, using it. And when the right comes into power, it refuses to act. And if we continue fighting on the back foot, I don't see how we can actually win this thing. The laws exist on a reason. There is a popular mandate to go ahead and enforce the borders. We need to go ahead and do that. And, the idea of having more government is totally the wrong way to go about it. And if, we need to empower the states, whatever we need to do, that's fine. But if all we're going to do is continually go back and forth and play ping pong in Washington while people are getting rich, I think people in every part of this country are right to ask, why are we invested in a system that isn't working for the benefit of the people?
Well, you've touched on an important point there, because underneath all of the ideology, underneath Trump's obvious failings, the reality is that there is unprecedented degrees of corruption throughout the entire federal government. And we keep seeing this over and over again. The same players keep coming on back. We know that there should have been a full investigation of the Hillary Clinton email server issue. There should have been a full audit of the Clinton Foundation, which, by the way, fails to qualify for a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. But again, we have seen James Comey and Loretta Lynch and all these people who are openly protecting this dark heart of our United States. And the corruption of the Clintons, of course, goes all the way back to mid-1980s in Arkansas, when Bill Clinton, as governor, was overseeing the U.S. end of the gun and drug running operation run by the CIA into Nicaragua. And everybody got rich along the way, and it's one of the big, deep, dark secrets of history. But because the Clintons have so many of these deep, dark secrets, they're virtually untouchable. But meanwhile, you've seen the machinery of government just go after Donald Trump on a myth, a fabrication, this Russian dossier, which turned out to be completely bogus. And Robert Mueller has been trying to find some way to link Trump with Russia for over a year and a half, millions of dollars involved, and he hasn't found it. And it's time for him to go. And, of course, the liberals want him to keep that investigation going so they can campaign on it in the coming months.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think the other reason why we saw the Russia probe, to be honest with you, is to cover what the Democrats did themselves. You look at the sale to Uranium One of 20% of the United States uranium to Russia. You look at President Obama, his famous hot mic, where he was talking to Medvedev and saying, I'll have more ability to do things after the election. I think that if we were going to look and see who got goods from Russia, and not just Russia, but to be honest with you, I think China is even a bigger threat. The Democratic Party has long been corrupt and has been doing some things that have been very questionable. And I agree with you about the Clintons. This whole thing goes back to Mena, Arkansas. And, it's no accident that, in Oklahoma City, that all the stuff for the Whitewater investigation, which everyone's forgotten 30 years after the fact, was still there. There's a trail of bodies behind that family and behind the whole deep state. And that's what really disgusts people. Let's look at what happened to Seth Rich. Let's ask some of these questions, but we don't even have the courage to do that. And to tell you the truth, it doesn't happen because too many in the Republicans have been part of the same problem. You said you were a Ron Paul guy, and I worked for Ron Paul in 2008, so we have that in common. You'll remember back in 2012 the tricks that the Romney people played at the Republican National Convention then, where they basically rigged the whole system against him. This is the deep state.
Yeah, that's the deep state. Okay, Tom, we got to take one more break for commercials. We'll be back with the last segment of our program after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Last segment of our program today. We're finishing up here with Tom Kaczynski. He's the author of the book, The Coming Civil War. It's available at Amazon.com. And Tom, there's a lot of good information you shared with us where, unfortunately, I'm going to have to agree with you that we may, in fact, be a lot closer to a major civil disruption than I was hoping to be the case. And you're right. It could break along any one of these lines: ideological, economic, immigration. It almost seems like it's only a matter of time before it's going to come apart. But I think one thing is very obvious, that despite its worldwide attacks on country after country after country, the reality is the United States is a dying empire lashing out in its death throes. And I don't think the United States could survive a new civil war, that it would balkanize. And that might be a better choice than going into a world war with the risk of nuclear weapons, which would be a bad day for everybody. So we've got about 3 minutes now for you to sum up to our listeners. Anything you want to share with them?
Yeah, I thank you for having me on, first of all. And to give people a little bit of optimism, I would just say that even though things do look very difficult, a lot of people want to believe in America. And if the right organizes itself and acts intelligently in the next 10 years, there's hope. We control the presidency. We still control the Congress. We control the judiciary. The military supports us. And most of the productive states and productive areas of this country are behind this. What has been lacking is not the ability of the majority, but just the vision and willingness to go ahead and do what's needed to take power. That's a difficult thing to say because it's going to force us to go to some very uncomfortable places where we can't do things the way we used to do them. Whether people would prefer that or to just let things die under the old rules is a question others will have to take. The books are designed to be easy to read. There's a lot of good factual information. Like you said, Amazon.com. Please check out my writing. Also, my website is www.nationalright.us. It's an effort to unite all the different parts of the right so that we can be together and we can mitigate the risk. People look at organization on the right as providing some sort of militant threat, but the truth is, the more organized we are, the more able we are to defend our family, our community, our loved ones, our churches, the better served we will be in preventing conflict, because the real danger that comes from a radicalized left is if no one stands up to them. That's how the Bolsheviks took over Russia, and we shouldn't let Antifa do that here in the United States or anyone else. Remember, the reason they're lashing out is they're mad that they didn't have the election they thought they stole. There is an opportunity there wake people up, talk to others. My book can help, but whatever you do, keep talking and keep hoping, and as I do, keep praying.
Well, you're absolutely right there. The one thing we can all do now, and it's peaceful, is keep talking with each other. Forget about social media. It's become utterly worthless. But we can talk to each other face to face, get to know our friends and neighbors. And you'd be surprised. You're probably going to find a lot more people as concerned about what's going on in this country as you are. Anyway, Tom, we are out of time. Thank you very much for being with us. We're going to let you go.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.
And let's see. There's the music. Okay, so that's it. Claire and I have to go run errands. Please stay tuned for John Stadmiller. I'm sure he's got lots of interesting things to share with you. And please, again, take what you have learned here, share it with everyone that you know. Use email, paper mail. Maybe it's time to go back to pamphlets and leafleting in this age of compromised social media. But we got to do something, absolutely. So please donate to Republic Broadcasting. Please donate to whatreallyhappened.com. And we'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.